All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Cornell Clayton. I'm director of the Foley Institute at WSU. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you out to our regular election prediction panel. We have the crack political scientists from the region here to give us their predictions. Happy Election Day. This is an exciting day. I love Election Day. I hate campaign ads and commercials, so that's the good news. They'll be over. Probably like most of you. The only one who likes commercials, I think, is Travis, who likes them so much he watches them all year long. But the rest of us, no more campaign commercials. But Election Day is a really exciting time. It's the one time where a lot of us are cynical about the influence of people with power and money and social connections. This is the one time in the year where your power is equal to everybody else's. You go in and you mark your ballot. It counts exactly the same as Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or Oprah Winfrey or anybody else. So it is a terrific day. If you haven't voted, make sure you get out and vote. You have till 8 o'clock tonight. There's some same-day registration. I think you can do it up here in the Cub. If not, you can go to Colfax at the county seat. Lots of enthusiasm about the election. Already nearly 40 million votes were cast before Election Day. So we're on record for, or on track for a record turnout. Probably in the neighborhood of 120, 130 million votes. Despite what all of the candidates are telling you, I can guarantee you it will not be the most important election in your lifetime. There will be other elections, and candidates will say that every time. So, but there is a lot at stake tonight. Just to remind you what's at stake, two magic numbers, 1 and 5. Those are the numbers that will determine whether or not the Congress changes partisan hands. In order to retake control of the House, Republicans need to pick up 5 seats. To retake control of the Senate, they need just 1 seat. This should be easy for Republicans to do, by the way. If you look at historical midterms, the president's party tends to lose a lot of seats. Since World War II, if you look at all the midterm elections, on average, the president's party has lost 26 seats in the House, 4 seats in the Senate. And since 2000, it's gotten even more volatile, the swings. On average, the president's party has, since 2006, has lost 41 seats in the House and 5 seats in the Senate. So by those historical records, this should be an easy accomplishment for the Republicans, but there's lots of factors that may make this midterm different, and I'm sure our panelists will be talking about those. So I've asked each of the panelists to take about 10 minutes, tell us what they think is most important about this election, what they're looking at tonight, but also to make this is a prediction panel, some specific predictions, and here's what I've asked them to predict. To predict both the seat shift in the House and in the Senate. I've asked them to predict the outcome of the Murray-Smiley Senate race here in Washington. I've asked them to give us also a point spread on that, so hopefully they'll do that. I've asked them to predict the outcome of 4 House contests here in Washington in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 8th congressional districts. So let me go ahead and introduce our panelists, and I will have them speak in the same order as I introduce them, and then we'll have some time for Q&A after they talk. I'll begin with our guest today, to my immediate right, Todd Donovan, who's a professor of political science at Western Washington University, with visiting appointments at Australia National University and several other universities. His research examines the intersection of political behavior, public opinion, and electoral institutions. He has authored, co-authored, or co-edited a dozen books and numerous articles in peer-reviewed journals of political science. He advises the media in several different countries about elections, and he has served as an expert witness in both state and federal courts on numerous election matters. Todd also currently serves as an elected official himself. He's a county commissioner over in Whatcom County. So Todd will lead off our discussion. He'll be followed by my colleague Travis Ridout, who's in the middle. Travis is the Thomas S. Foley Distinguished Professor of Government and Public Policy, and he is also the director of the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs here at WSU. He is one of the country's leading experts on political advertising and serves as the co-director of the Wesleyan Project, which studies and tracks political advertising. So he is our expert on political advertising. Travis is widely published in the top journals in political science and mass communications. And his most recent book is entitled Political Advertising in the United States. It was published in 2021. And then finally, Travis is not in the middle, he's on the far right. In the middle is my other colleague here at WSU, Michael Ritter. He's an assistant professor of American politics here. His research focuses on voting, elections, and election administration. He has published a number of articles in top political science journals, and he's co-authored a book, Accessible Elections, How the States Can Help Americans Vote. It was published by Oxford University Press in 2020. Michael's also currently working on a second book examining how voting laws and election administration have impacted elections in the United States since 2016. So, let's welcome our guests.
I didn't have a print, so my notes are on the screen here. Thanks for that introduction, Cornell. Tangled up in chords here. So I'm going to talk about ballot measures are going to be on in various states, probably because nobody else will, but I study direct democracy. That's one of the main areas of my research. And there's about 130, so it's not a huge number this year. But some of these maybe will affect turnout in ways that we're not expecting. So we know that when the more initiatives you have on the ballot, you get more turnout. So I'll just kind of go over these real quick. I'm keeping track of the time. And then I'll give my prediction. I actually have two sets of predictions. I have some for my students too. So as far as what's on the ballot, there's of these 130 measures, there's 3 states that actually have initiatives to roll back the ability to use initiatives. Arizona, Arkansas, and South Dakota, and I'll get to the why of that. But this is Republican state legislators who've been in power for a while that used to be pro-direct democracy. Republicans, when they're out of power, now don't like some of the stuff that's getting on the ballot in several states. But it's changed. It's like the out party is the one that uses the initiative process more. So now that marijuana is on the ballot in Arkansas and South Dakota, making it harder to pass ballot measures is on the ballot in those states as well. So that's something I'm going to keep watching. But it's interesting because you're getting these states that are, quote, red states, but voters are passing minimum wage laws, drug reforms, and legalizing recreational marijuana. So that's something I'll be paying attention to. Ranked choice voting is also something sort of pet research area of mine. This is on the ballot in Seattle. It's a charter amendment to adopt ranked choice voting, which is, it's not a proportional election system, but it's a different way of voting that lets third place parties maybe have more influence. Portland's got a version of that on the ballot that would be a proportional system. Clark County, Evanston, Illinois, it's on the ballot in Nevada. Couple other places, and this is something that is being used in Alaska. So we'll say a couple things about the Alaska races. Those are going to be done. We won't know the results probably for a couple of weeks, but some of the first federal races to be elected by ranked choice voting. So that actually, the Alaska one, just talking to Cornell about this is going to be interesting because there's a Democrat that won the special election, which is a rare thing for an election in Alaska, running against Sarah Palin, another Republican and a Libertarian, and that there probably won't be a majority winner, and how the preferences transfer in that will be interesting. But for reasons that I'm not quite sure of, and maybe we can talk about this later, the Republican Party, state parties, various places, Republican state legislators have come out opposed to ranked choice voting, and that was even before, how do you say her name? Patola, yeah, thanks. Before she defeated Palin. So what happens in the Senate and the House race there will be interesting, but it takes a long time to get those results in. Slavery's on the ballot in 5 states. To what's the indentured servitude, or what's the word? People in prison being able to be forced to work without pay. That's actually put on by legislators, even conservative legislators in Alabama, Louisiana, Oregon, Tennessee, and Vermont. I'm not sure how much people are paying attention. I can't see any polling on these, but it'll be interesting to see how that would change how people who are incarcerated have to be paid for labor. Abortion's on the ballot in 6 states, and various, actually in opposite directions, where conservative legislators have put referendum on in Kansas, Kentucky, and Montana that are similar to the one that was on the ballot in Kansas that would have made it more restrictive, more restrictions on abortion now that the Dobbs decision has passed. In the other direction, California, Vermont, the legislatures there have put protections on abortion rights on the ballot. And the one that's maybe more interesting in terms of turnout is there's an initiative on the ballot in Michigan. And this could maybe make some of the predictions for some of the House seats there a little harder, because that initiative might be driving on people that otherwise wouldn't vote in a midterm. Last set, and this gets back to why on some states there's legislative referred measures to roll back the ability to use initiatives. Citizens in South Dakota and Arkansas put legalizing recreational use of marijuana on the ballot. It's also on the ballot in Missouri, North Dakota, and the legislature put it on the ballot in Maryland. And that's, those are interesting because these are things where clearly you've got legislators that are out of step where public opinion is. These will probably pass, which is why these legislators want to make it hard to use the initiatives in these states. But it's always, even in Washington, like it was a 2012 when voters legalized recreational use here, the legislature could have done it and they didn't. They were so out of step with public opinion. Colorado, same thing. These almost always pass. So it's an interesting question, like why don't legislators do that when it's something that the public's in favor of? Okay, predictions. 2 sets of predictions. So Cornell sent the prompt out that we were just that we're going to be giving you the responses to. I'm teaching a parties, campaigns, and elections class, so it canceled today because I'm here. So I gave them this. I gave them this project, and there's about 25 people. So I took the average of what they estimated for the Democrats' seat loss. I took for the Senate, the House, and then the Murray margin. And I cranked this up last night. They were due last night. I made my prediction Sunday, so if anything's changed since Sunday. But they're actually really close. So the first one is the students. It's an average of a lot of range here, but they had 20 seats. The Democratic seat loss. The students range from 56 seat loss to 7, but just taking the average, it comes up to 20. In the Senate, they range a seat loss from 8 to a gain of the Democrats for 1, but average out to 1.8. So I'll say that's 20 seats for the House, 2 seats for the Senate, and the average for Murray comes out to be 54%. Mine, and I didn't ask about the legislative races. 21 seats. I'm not going to get into the weeds about why I did this, because I deferred more to the 538 than the real clear politics one. 2 Senate seats lost. Murray +3, and then the Republicans holding the 3rd, the 4th. You're really having us predict the 4th. That one's not really hard. Holding the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, and then I will say the Republicans pick up the 8th just to have something different on the table there. So
Okay.
that's what I got. Watch the cables here.
Travis?
All right, so if you look at the House seats as they're constituted right now, Joe Biden won a majority of those House seats back in 2020 after winning the national popular vote by about 4.5%. Thus, one way to think about it is that Democrats would need to win the House popular vote by about 4.5% to maintain control of the U.S. House of Representatives. So what do current polling averages say? Well, the House generic ballot question shows Republicans winning by about 1 percentage point. Thus, these generic ballot polls would have to be off by about 5.5%. That's all a bit rough. In the pro-Republican direction for Democrats to win the House. And this seems unlikely, especially given the midterm curse that Cornell talked about. Since 1946, the President's Party has won seats in the House of Representatives 2 times, 1998 and 2002. Okay, well, what about the Senate? If we look at the Senate, there are some very, very close Senate races, according to the polls: Nevada, Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, North Carolina, even New Hampshire. And so the polls suggest that the Senate could easily stay in Democratic hands or easily become a Republican Senate after the start of the new year. But this all goes back to the question, should we trust the polls? In 2016, support for Donald Trump on Republican candidates in general was vastly understated in the polls, especially in states with large white blue-collar populations. And this was attributed to the unwillingness of people with lower education, lower political sophistication to respond to the pollsters. And that occurred at the same time that many of the people falling in this group were highly supportive of Donald Trump. And so in response, many pollsters started weighting their polls based on education, making sure people from all educational groups were adequately represented in the polling. Makes sense, but this didn't entirely solve the problem in 2020, especially in Midwestern states with large numbers of blue-collar white voters. And so the main reason given for this, our autopsy says, is that even though the polls were adequately representing Republicans, they weren't adequately representing a certain type of Republican who was more likely to support Donald Trump. And that's a Republican who doesn't trust in government, doesn't trust in institutions like polling firms. And so they weren't answering the questions. And so you can't give those people more weight in your polls if they aren't answering the questions. And so the question is, so are we seeing that in 2022? If we are, then Fetterman in Pennsylvania and Ryan in Ohio and Barnes in Wisconsin are going down to big defeats today. And this could affect some other Senate races as well, such as the one in Nevada. That said, I think there are some good reasons to think that the polls may be doing a better job this year than they were in 2020 and 2016. One is that Donald Trump is not on the ballot, and so the connection between Republican support and support for Trump should be weaker. Indeed, if we look at the polls in 2018, when Donald Trump was not directly on the ballot, they did a pretty decent job of predicting those midterm outcomes. Earlier this year, there were some warning signs that the polling was getting it wrong again. Democratic Senate candidates in these Midwestern states were overperforming Joe Biden's margin. But actually, within the past month or so, they're doing about equally as well as Joe Biden, suggesting that maybe there isn't a problem. The only exception to this is Tim Ryan, the Democrat in Ohio, who is overperforming Joe Biden. Maybe that's a problem with polling, or maybe it's the fact that he's a pretty good candidate who's running a pretty good campaign against someone with no political experience who's not running a very good campaign. Finally, midterm elections typically attract voters who are more highly educated. In the past, that was good for Republicans. But since 2016 especially, that relationship has shifted. More educated voters are now more Democratic. And so missing some of those low education voters might not be debilitating to poll results just because they're less likely to show up. So my predictions. Democratic seat loss in the House. I said 20 yesterday, but then I saw one tweet this morning that changed my vibe. So now I'm saying 23 seat loss.
Well, I'm glad you're scientific about it.
Yeah. Democratic seat loss in the Senate of 0. Although this will, we'll have to wait until December to actually know if that's true, because the Georgia Senate race is going to a runoff. That's my big prediction. Let's see, Patty Murray will return to the Senate for a sixth term. She's going to win by 7 percentage points. In the House races, in the 3rd District, Joe Kent, the Republican, is going to win by 4 points. In the 4th District, Newhouse is going to win by 14 points. Kathy McMorris Rogers is going to win by 15 percentage points. And in the 8th District, Schreier is going to win by 0.5 percentage points. So we won't know the result of that for at least a week. So there you have it.
Okay.
Above and beyond there.
Yeah.
I need to be writing down the predictions.
You gotta watch out for this.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I've entitled my remarks Forecasting the 2022 Midterm Election Alongside Considerations Regarding Election Laws and Election Administration. This is a momentous election, and based on many polling predictions, this important election will likely result in a divided government, meaning a Congress and a presidency controlled by different political parties. The key question, though, regarding this and national level results and how these translate to congressional seats, as Travis and Todd have pointed out, is whether that divided government will consist of a Republican Party that controls both the House and Senate, or just the House. But we can talk more about those possibilities during the Q&A section. What I want to call particular attention to are factors I think are particularly important in this midterm election. Variations in state election laws and election administration provisions across and within American states, and changes in these respects since the 2020 election that may have critical effects and outcomes on today's election. For example, many of today's election contests, including contests will determine the control of the House and Senate, will be decided by a few percentage points. And political scientists know that differences in election laws or administration provisions can shift voter turnout by several percentage points. That is to say, election laws and administration provisions will likely play a significant role in the 2022 midterm elections. As a matter of terminology, an election law refers to a mechanism whereby a person registers to vote or casts a ballot. Examples include automatic voter registration, in-person early voting, mail voting, and so on. Election administration, on the other hand, refers to how these laws are implemented. For example, the number and quality of poll workers, or the convenience of locations of polling sites or mail drop-off boxes. Each of these can be considered features of election administration that moderate one's ability to cast a ballot in person or via mail. Regarding voting rules and the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 4 is called the Times, Places, and Manners Clause of the Constitution, and gives states extensive authority for implementing a wide variety of election laws and administration provisions. For example, states can determine the time they afford for mail voting. They can dictate where individuals cast ballots in a state, and they also can determine how individuals cast ballots. We can also see this diversity through recent polling data and voting data made available through the United States Elections Project, with this data being reported from yesterday, November 7th. As of yesterday, approximately 40 million people across the country had cast ballots early, with about 18 million of these coming from in-person early votes and 22 million coming from returned mail ballots. Washingtonians have, as of yesterday, returned at least a couple million mail ballots. Early statistics suggest that Republican voters are slightly more likely to be in-person early voters, and Democratic voters are slightly more likely to be mail voters. Moving backward in time, if we remember the 2020 election, we perhaps recall that the use of mail voting played a critical role in the 2020 election. For the 2022 election, will party differentials in mail or early voting returns critically shape the election outcome? I think that's an important question to be aware of when we look at election results. And this is a question we don't know for certain today, but we will know once election results become available. Next, I would like to offer a couple examples of how election laws and administration provisions vary by states, because I don't think all Americans understand how vastly election laws and administration provisions can vary by state. Now, the 2020 election period certainly increased awareness of election law and administration mechanics of U.S. elections. What we also likely became more aware of regarding the 2020 election was how these mechanics vary by states. Washington, for example, is one of the few universal mail voting states in the country, which basically means that all registered voters are automatically sent to mail ballot for an election. A few other states like Oregon have universal mail voting, but other states also have other forms of mail voting, like no excuse absentee or excuse required absentee, which are very different. Or they may also have in-person early voting, or even simply put, in-person election day voting. That is to say, what seems like a conventional way of voting in Washington may seem largely familiar or unfamiliar to a voter from another state. Another facet of election administration that also varies by state is when mail ballots can be pre-processed, which can refer to verifying signatures, opening envelopes, and flattening ballots to get them ready for tabulation, that is, counting before Election Day. Some states, like Washington, permit the pre-processing of mail ballots upon receipt, whereas other states, like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, only allow this processing on Election Day. Some of you may remember how, the night of the November 2020 election, these latter two states seemingly switched from secure Trump states to Biden states the next morning. This change is largely an artifact of, one, the higher likelihood in the 2020 election that Democratic voters were casting mail ballots, and two, that ballots in these states that were sent by mail couldn't be processed and counted until Election Day. So a red mirage became a blue wave in those states, so to speak. Obviously, these election outcomes caused a lot of consternation and confusion among those not familiar with state-by-state variations in mail voting administration, but for a person who looks at election administration, it's more understandable. Now, regardless of the explanations behind these 2020 election outcomes, the election law and administration responses to these outcomes likely will have an impact on the 2022 midterm election results. What I mean by this is changes in election laws and administration provisions state by state over the past 2 years. For example, in partial response to allegations like the big steal or the notion that massive scale voter fraud stole the 2020 election away from former President Trump, a number of states have passed more restrictive voting laws. According to the Brennan Center for Justice's Voting Laws Roundup from October 2022, 20 states have passed restrictive voting laws since the 2020 election. These restrictions include, but are not limited to, requirements that voters provide ID numbers when they apply to vote by mail, prohibitions against mail drop boxes, limitations on absentee voting, and in the case of the state of Montana, getting rid of same-day registration. Other states, on the other hand, have either maintained or expanded access to the ballot. According to the same Brennan Center report, between January and September this year, 12 states enacted 19 laws that have expanded access to the ballot. These laws include, but are not limited to, laws that improve access to mail voting, improve access to voting for individuals with disabilities, expand opportunities by which to register to vote, such as with automatic vote registration, and creating or expanding in-person early voting. Now you may ask yourself, why does this all matter, and why do changes in election laws or administration provisions matter for the 2022 election? Well, in my research, Accessible Elections, which examines how state election laws and administration provisions impact voter turnout, I find that states that have more accessible voting laws, like universal mail voting in Washington, and states that have more accessible election administrations, like having more mail drop boxes for mail voters, facilitates not only higher voter turnout, but also lower voter inequality between individuals of different races and socioeconomic statuses. My research also shows that in-person early voting, mail voting, and same-day registration increase likelihoods of voting across the board. This also means in elections, that in elections decided by several percentage points, election laws or administration factors could play critical differences. According to Ballotpedia, for instance, in the 2020 election contests for the House and Senate, about 17% of House contests were decided by less than 10 percentage points, and 34% of Senate contests were decided by less than 10 percentage points. This translates to more than 70 House seats and 10 Senate seats in 2020, which are seat differences enough to determine majority status for either major party in either chamber of Congress. Making election laws or administrative provisions more or less restrictive could make a decisive difference in this election. So, as we find ourselves on the verge of the end of the November 22 election, I'd like us to keep in mind how the centrality of election laws and election administration provisions can shape election outcomes. A couple of the critical Senate elections, such as between Fetterman and Oz in Pennsylvania or Warnock and Walker in Georgia, are within a couple percentage points, if the polls, as Travis hinted at earlier, are to be believed. A Washington House election of the 8th District between Kim Schreier and Matt Larkin is also an election at the margins, according to the polls, that could be decisively impacted by variations in election laws and election administration. Provisions, to conclude, differences in election laws and election administration provisions could push these and other election contests across the country in the direction of victory or defeat. And I will provide my election predictions at this point. I do predict that the Republican Party will retake the House. Well, will retake the House. I'm going by the 538 margin in regards to the House, and that margin would be 225 Republican seats to 210 Democratic seats. Currently, the 538 poll is predicting that the Republican Party will win 51 seats in the Senate, and the Democratic Party will have 49 seats. But there is a margin of error that overlaps between both predictions, and so I think the Senate is kind of on the fence as a whole as to whether it goes to the Republican or Democratic Party. And Senate races like between, like the Senate race in Georgia or in Pennsylvania could make critical differences.
So what's the seat swing in the House you're predicting?
I don't have that exact number on me. But
Okay.
yeah, I'm predicting the final distribution will be 225 Republicans to 210 Democrats in the House, and 50-50 House and Senate.
So it's a 10.
Yeah.
10 seat pickup, huh? 10 seats.
It's a 220 right now. So if they go down to 210, the
Yeah.
10 seat loss.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
10 and 0.
Yep.
Okay.
Oh, okay. So I also predict Murray will retain her Senate seat in the state of Washington. She will win by 8.6 percentage points.
8.6.
538 predictions. I also predict Kent will win in the 3rd district. Newhouse will win the 4th district. Rogers will win in the 5th district. Schreier will win more narrowly in the 8th district. And yeah, those encapsulate my predictions for.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, we got some time for some questions for our panelists. Matt?
Just point out before I ask my question that Lawrence O'Donnell last night quoted William Goldman, that nobody knows nothing. That seems to fit this election pretty effectively for me. My question is about messaging, though. Hillary Rosen and James Carville have trashed their own party recently, their own party's messaging, saying they've missed the messaging on the economy, when in fact they could have effectively messaged on the economy, and pointed out that the Republicans really don't have any answers on the economy. They just don't happen to be in charge right now, and they're sort of leaving that space to the Republicans. Do you agree with that critique? Could Democratic messaging have been more effective?
Okay, Travis, this is a good one for you.
Yeah.
As the campaign guy.
Yeah, that's a hard one. Because when you're messaging on something that you're not favored on, you make it more salient in the voters' minds, and then they're thinking about that when they're voting. Whereas what I really want them to be thinking about is this other thing over there, right? Think about Donald Trump when you're voting, right? Don't think about the state of the economy right now. And so it's a decision every campaign has to make. Do we try to change the subject or try to frame a message favorable to our side on what is most salient in voters' minds?
But in this case, if you were them, what would you have done?
I get very specific, and I'd say, in particular states, maybe like Washington, Murray's focus on abortion may not have been such a bad idea, given that she didn't have that many options. But in a state like Georgia, for instance, then maybe focusing on the economy would have made more sense.
So I have a different question about messaging, and that is the messaging of the outcome of the election. Because going all through the summer and into the fall, Democrats have been saying, we're going to hold the Senate and we have a good chance of even holding the House, right? Now it looks like, your predictions are that the Dems are going to lose anywhere from 10 to 20 seats in the House, and anywhere from 0 to 2 seats in the Senate. That's going to look like a red wave to some people, when in fact it's not. Historically, it's better than the average seat loss for the president's party, right? And in particular, over the last 4 midterm election cycles, it would be significantly better performance than the president's party has done. So is this a messaging debacle for the Democrats?
How do you run an ad about like this is the historic pattern of midterm elections? You're doing better. You can't message that, but there's just fewer seats in play too. We haven't really talked about that. I mean, there's not that many places you can throw money at to move a House seat. So
And why is that?
Redistricting.
yeah.
Okay, yeah, Amy?
Hey, thank you guys. That was awesome. This is so much fun. You probably know what my question is. I really like Todd's discussion of how referendum initiatives are going to change voter turnout, bring out different people. And I was wondering if you could comment on the Dodd bump, because we, when the decision was first made, people like me, who I'm a glass half full person, I was like, oh yeah, this is gonna really mobilize a lot of people that normally wouldn't have voted. And I heard voter turnout, there were 69% of new voter turnout. These were figures back right after Dodd. Most of them were women. So I was wondering what your views, I mean, obviously your predictions kind of answer the question, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about the Dodd vote.
So the Dobbs decision is the
Dobbs.
one where the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, and overturned the abortion law. So who wants to take that?
I mean, I mentioned Michigan because that's a state where it's on the ballot, so people are being primed to think about the candidates in terms of those issues, and that'll maybe have a mobilizing effect. The other places it's on the ballot are maybe, like South Dakota, whatever. I mean, it's not going to matter there. But I think the timing of when the decision happened and the leaking of the decision, when it was on the ballot in Kansas, you saw that massive mobilization of people coming out in a conservative state to vote down a pretty restrictive measure that the legislature put on. If the decision was a little more close to the midterm, or the leak of the decision had happened, a little, I think some of the steam's run out of it a bit. And you mentioned like Murray's campus, a lot of the state legislators, that's the only thing they're talking about on the Democratic side is protecting Roe, in Washington. And I just don't see that being such a mobilizing thing now. Maybe it would have been a few months ago.
Let me just say one other thing about Dobbs. I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest it's still going to have a mobilizing effect in red states where abortion rights are in jeopardy. So that's what happened in Kansas, for instance, over the summer. Really had a mobilizing effect. Less evidence it's going to have a mobilizing effect in blue states where women and others don't feel like there's a jeopardy for abortion rights, right? So there may be a differential impact of Dobbs depending on blue states versus red states. So, yeah, we're here.
So if there is a red wave like you guys are predicting, I think there will be more trust from Republicans in the election system. If they see the system works in their favor, obviously there's going to be less apprehensiveness.
That's an interesting question because, for instance, some Republican secretaries of state are running on the premise that election administration needs to be more properly conducted to protect against, like I said, the allegations of big steal or alleged voter fraud. And so, I think if Republicans, I think, are going to have a lot of success in this election, but at least interesting questions if you win an election based on, voter fraud claims, and how do you protect legitimacy of your own election?
Okay. Let's get one over here. Yeah.
I was going to ask if we do see the type of shift in Congress that we are anticipating, or that you guys have anticipated, what major events in the next 2 years do you foresee in terms of legislative pushes or just party pushes? Because as I was speaking to somebody, they said that if there is more of a red wave than we do anticipate, we are likely to see a lot of attempts at impeaching Biden and things like that. Are there any major trends that you anticipate seeing with the election results that you anticipate?
With Kevin McCarthy in charge of the House, what's going to happen?
Debt ceiling.
Debt ceiling. Okay.
Debt ceiling will be
Yep.
trying to default on the full faith and credit of the United States as a bargaining chip because you can't pass anything without it being vetoed. I think that'll be one of the first things we
And what do you
see.
think he'll want? Cuts in Social Security, Medicare?
Yeah. Cuts in social services and spending, cutting back some of the stimulus money that's still flowing around. I don't know, but I think that's the big
IRS
stick that they
IRS
can
agents.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, I think that's absolutely right.
That's
We're
it.
looking forward to a lot of gridlock, a lot of debt ceiling crises and things like that.
I'll make a prediction right now. You're going to hear a lot about Hunter Biden over the next 2 years, like 24/7 probably. Yeah.
Ukraine.
I think that Trump has said that he's probably going to announce his run in a couple of days, and I think Biden, he used to say that he was going to run, but now he's kind of a bit more on the fence and saying, oh, I might run or I might not. So we don't know if we're going to get the rematch that everyone wants. But so my question is will the results of this election affect either of those candidates' caucus at all? If the Democrats do bad, will Biden just decide not to run, or will he just decide to run anyways, or is there any sort of effects on that?
Predicting about Biden. Is Biden going to run? What do you say?
If it was a complete blowout, maybe he'd be less inclined to dodge the question.
Complete blowout meaning what?
Like historic numbers.
40 seat loss.
Yeah, and half a dozen Senate seats lost. Then he would own that. But this is gonna be a marginal, normal loss. I don't think it's enough to maybe push him off the fence and say I'm not gonna run.
I think for an incumbent president, I think that makes them less likely not to run for re-election. In the case of Joe Biden, I think he probably would also think that if he were not to run for re-election, it would be a new Democratic candidate running against perhaps former President Trump in the election, and the Democratic candidate would lose the incumbency advantage, in the election. So I think in terms of party competitiveness, I think there is an incentive for Biden to run again.
Yeah, I think the Democratic Party, by and large, would love to see a new face, a new winner who can go and reclaim the White House, or not claim it, not a reclamation. But how does the Democratic Party unite around that person, right? There will be a lot of rumblings, especially if it's a 40-seat loss in the House, that Joe Biden is an anchor. We got to do something to replace him on the top of the ticket in 2024.
But that won't happen because you guys predicted no more than 20.
I said 23.
23, that's right. Yeah.
I think Michael already knows what my question is. But the Oregon gubernatorial election is a three-way race right now between three women. We have a not so strong Democratic candidate who's basically the embodiment of the Oregon establishment. And polling has basically a neck and neck race. I guess, and also we have the Arizona gubernatorial election. So what are your guys' thoughts on the upcoming gubernatorial elections, which could probably play much more roles in people's lives than they realize?
And let's throw in the Wisconsin and Kansas gubernatorial elections. You guys follow those at all? Go ahead.
So
Go on.
predictions in these gubernatorial races?
Yes.
That's what we're wanting. Independents always fade, or almost always fade, in three-way races. So it looks like Oregon is coming down to Democrat versus Republican. Democrats have an advantage in that state. I think the Democrat has a much better chance than she might have 2 or 3 months ago, according to the polls. Maybe is even favored at this point.
She is. Up by 2.
Wisconsin, the Governor Evers has always done just a little bit better than the Senate candidate Barnes in the polling, and so he might squeak through. Arizona, I can't predict Arizona, that's a tough one. Kansas, I wouldn't be surprised if they re-elected their Democratic governor.
Arizona will be the fun one to watch.
What are you predicting there?
Don't let them out of the room until they predict
That's
Arizona.
by the way, that's Katie Lake. Not Katie Lake. It's Katie Hobbs and what's the Lake's first name? Carrie. So
She can't lose.
and Carrie Lake is one of the most vehement election deniers in the country running right now. Katie Hobbs was Secretary of State and actually defended how fraud-free the Arizona elections were in 2020. So that's a really interesting race to watch. Most polls have it neck and neck. I think it lays up a couple of points in most of the polls. But, yeah. Alex?
I'd just like to go back to the messaging thing, and I just have this sense that the Republicans constantly pounding on inflation issues, including blaming Democrats and Biden, and it's clearly essentially a worldwide problem phenomenon. My general question is, could the Democrats, which I would have done, simply blame Trump for international inflation because he invited Putin to do what he did implicitly and then praised it? Great. Would that have been a possible message that could have rehooked, given the Democrats a way to fight back in terms of inflation?
I don't think so. Voters are pretty myopic. They look at what's just happened, who's in charge right now. And yes, all these problems facing the world are very complex and have their history probably dating back dozens of years, if not more, but voters focus on the here and now. For a lot of voters, what they can manage is to either reward or punish who's in power right now. I like how things are going. I'll vote for the incumbent. I don't like how things are going. I'll vote against the incumbent. And this is not just true in the United States. We've got evidence from just about every country in the world that this is how voters behave. So I'm skeptical Democrats could have successfully blamed Trump for inflation.
But they are still campaigning against him relentlessly. This is an election with the democracy itself is at stake. That's a message that I don't think is working. I mean, they're bringing up Trump and people are whatever with that.
Although the polls show that there's now 3/4 of Americans are concerned about American democracy, concerned about political violence.
90%.
90%. Yeah. Yeah. So it's having some.
That's not what they're voting on, though.
Okay.
Building off what Dr. Ridout was saying earlier, the midterms are traditionally a time when a candidate can pop their name into the early primary races for the presidential. So I'll take DeSantis off the table because it's the obvious answer. Is there anyone we should be looking out for on either side of the house who can put themselves forward for an early presidential run, especially in the event that Biden doesn't run? Is there any Democratic candidate who might pull themselves out of the shadows?
I got to.
Yeah, there are a few candidates. Senator Warnock in Georgia, if he wins re-election, certainly that will put his name in the national conversation for a future presidency. That's one that immediately comes to mind. You've got more.
I got Gavin Newsom, who's the governor of California, who's been one of the most outspoken critics of the Democratic Party for not being more aggressive. I'll put another dark horse, Josh Shapiro, who's running for governor in Pennsylvania right now. And if he wins, I think he could be some of the typical type Democratic candidate who comes out of nowhere.
Who's the senator from South Carolina that's not Lindsey Graham?
Tim Scott.
Yeah,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
a name that's popping up.
On the Republican side. Tim Scott's me out. Yeah, let's get somebody else. Yeah, over here.
I like what Ridout said about the voters being a very "what have you done for me lately" type of society, you know. But my question is kind of like unrelated. How consequential do you think the 2022 ranked choice voting initiatives are in like Nevada and other states?
That's you.
Consequential in terms of getting people excited and turning out for
Like
them.
consequential as in how will we see this trend pop up, and will we see more ranked choice voting in different states and cities and such?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a sort of linear trend of more places adopting it. At the state level, like Nevada, if it passes, they have to pass it twice to have an initiative go into effect. So it'll be on the ballot in Nevada again if it passes. But yeah, the national advocacy groups are trying to find more states that have the initiative process to get it going statewide. So
Two states have it right now,
Maine and
Alaska.
Alaska, Nevada would be the third, but it's, you know, at some point you hit a wall where there's only initiative, there's just the initiative states, you can get this on the ballot because the legislators aren't really doing it. But at the local level, through charter review commissions and Seattle City Council actually put it on the ballot in response to an approval voting measure. Portland's, it came out of a charter review process. So a lot of cities and counties have to do that periodically, and I think you'll see it not like exploding, but kind of a steady linear increase.
By the way, the reason it has to be done through ballot initiative is because politicians who've won their office on the current system don't want to change that system, right?
Yeah, I tried to get it on the ballot.
Okay. Yeah.
So in campaigns, especially during this election cycle, we've seen a sort of reinvigoration of masculinity as a campaign trait. Do we see that as being as effective as it used to be? And I'm thinking of candidates like Masters and people in that sort of way of elections or candidates.
Sounds like a campaign advertising.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really complicated. There's research that shows that for executive offices, for instance, voters prefer someone who's more of a leader, whom they associate with more masculine traits. But for other types of offices, they want more, maybe a woman candidate is preferred, or someone with more feminine traits. And so it also depends on which issues you're talking about. We think of some issues as more masculine, the military, for instance. But if we're talking about healthcare, then that's something that we might prefer that message coming from a woman. And so my understanding is that it's quite complicated and there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Okay, let's see, is there somebody who hasn't asked a question yet? Okay, I gotta go back to you, I guess.
So John, yeah, I gotta go back. So John Meacham was over at UW last Sunday, and it was streamed over here. And as you know, he's got his new book on the lessons of Lincoln for our current political times. And he is genuinely frightened about election denialism. He is really, and so is Beth Schloss and some other historians, are genuinely frightened about the future of our system. How frightened are the three of you about election denialism and how it may spread?
Okay, I was going to say, to respond to the other question, I don't think it's going to go away. And then the fact that it's going to be another week of counting in some of these states with a lot of mail ballots is just going to open up. Like, no one's going to be talking about it so much today, but 3 days from now, that's when the window's open for that.
How dangerous is it for the next 20 years?
Yeah, it's fundamentally eroding confidence in elections and the sense that a winner is a legitimate winner. And I don't think, and the extent that that's polarized between 2016 and 2020, between, Democrats think elections were run better in 2020 than they ever were, and Republicans think they were run worse than they ever were. That's not, and that then the results are illegitimate. That's not going away today. So,
the data that we were talking about that shows Americans are concerned about democracy, the health of American democracy, 80-90% are concerned, right? But Republicans say the number one reason is because of Democrats, and Democrats say the number one reason is Republicans, right?
Right.
So this isn't going to go away until,
that makes it worse.
Until our elections are not so close. Whenever you have close elections, you're going to have disputes over how the elections were run. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you guys for being out here, by the way. On my ballot, I had a Republican candidate versus an American First Republican Party. What is that exactly?
it's whatever you want it to be. The way that we slipped the top two primaries through the Supreme Court decision that overturned the blanket primary was candidates can say they prefer any party as long as the voters don't believe that they're nominated by or endorsed or officially representing that party. And you get, it's like 16 characters? There's some limit of, you could be Sam and Yoga Party, you can be Grand Old Party, you
Rent's
can be...
too damn high.
Yeah. If it fits within whatever the state lets you, there doesn't have to be that party.
Got it. Thank you.
All right, we got time for one more question probably. Back there, yeah.
Do you guys know when and where we can find results when they come in and stuff?
I'm sorry?
Do you guys know like when and where we can get results? I don't know if like you guys know that. I just
Yeah, no, and the major media sites have,
Okay.
you know, CNN will just be refreshing all night and all week.
And they'll start coming in at 5 o'clock. That's when the polls close back east. So starting at 5 o'clock, you'll start seeing some information coming in from back east. Yeah. So let me ask you guys two other wonky questions before I let you guys go. One is what was critical in 2020 is the suburbs. They shifted remarkably to the left, to the Democratic Party. Do you, A, expect them to move back towards Republicans in this election, especially with the crime issue and inflation? And the other question has to do with Hispanic vote. Democrats have been leading Hispanic voters. Typically, Republicans get about 30%, but in more recent elections, it's closer to high 30s, maybe even low 40s. So what do you guys think about those two issues? Suburban voters, Hispanic voters?
I'll just say real quick, I don't know if it's people shifting or are they just not showing up in the numbers that they showed up 2 years ago. That's the bigger issue.
Turnout.
Do those same voters show up and not as likely?
I could see suburban voters being more in play, like you said, with issues regarding school choice, criminal justice. The Republican Party's been very active in messaging in those areas, and I think that could drive some suburban voters more in a rightward direction. And there's also the general pattern, as we've noted, is that there's a shift to the other party from the presidential or midterm elections. There's a theory called balancing theory that kind of notes that some voters have an innate preference for basically voting for the other party to be in power to kind of moderate the political influences of the presidential party. So, maybe those issue shiftings among suburban voters may pick up on that.
I think we have a tendency to think that a group's moving in one direction and it'll just continue to move in that direction forever, right? And that's not how it happens. If you look at Hispanic voters across the past 3 decades, it's sort of been in increased support for Democrats, increased support for Republicans, and ebb and flow, and that probably varies depending on the location, the particular state as well. And so I don't foresee any long-term trend in the Hispanic vote, but there is certainly an ebb and flow.
Okay. Well, we have the predictions. I've written them down so we can remind them next week. Before we thank our guests, let me remind you, next week we have Keantha Duncan, who is the president of the NAACP Spokane chapter here. She's going to be talking about race and American democracy, and in particular in the wake of the midterm elections. So join us next week, and now let's thank our guests for